3, 2, 1. Just give it a minute. Starting. All right, you're good to go.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this forum on Energy Policy WA's Governance and Legislation Project, or what we call Project Eagle. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. I'd like to commence today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all meeting. In my case, I'm joining you from Perth, which is on the traditional lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people. In the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. If we pop over to the next slide, please, Keely, to our agenda for today. My name's Kate Ryan, and this morning myself and Ashwin Raj, who is our Project Director here at Energy Policy WA for Project Eagle, will give you an overview of this project. Last week we released the discussion paper, which hopefully you've all at least seen the link to, and we've got that open for consultation through to the 1st of November. As you can see from the slide, we are recording this meeting, and following the meeting we'll pop both the recording and these slides up on our website. The format for today is laid out pretty clearly there, so Ash and I will give you a quick overview of the paper and our proposed Project Eagle reforms. We anticipate that'll take a little over half an hour, so we'll have some time at the end for some questions. If you've got a question that comes to you during the presentation, please pop it in the chat function, and if you see a question in the chat that you're interested in hearing the answer to, great if you could hit like. We will do a popularity contest, so the most popular questions will likely be answered first. But if there's time at the end, we'll also give you an opportunity to raise some additional questions. Flip on to the next slide. Project. We'll go one more. Thanks, Keely. Project Eagle is part of our energy transformation strategy, which is the Western Australian Government's strategy for enabling the transition to low emissions and distributed energy resources. The second stage of the energy transformation strategy was launched by the Minister for Energy in July and includes initiatives over the coming 4 years, which are grouped in these 4 themes that you can see on this slide. Project Eagle is an initiative within theme number 4, which is regulating for the future. This theme is really focused on continuing to modernise our regulatory frameworks to make them more fit for purpose and better able to keep pace with the changes underway in our sector. It's probably not the sexiest of the themes that we've got work under, but certainly very important. Just over to the next slide, and reforms to the governance of the energy sector did actually commence during stage 1 of the energy transformation strategy. In 2020, government confirmed and clarified the roles of 3 key governance bodies in the sector, which are the 3 you can see there. And this included formalising Energy Policy WA as the body responsible for market evolution and overall coordination. So consistent with this, on 1 July this year, we saw the transfer of some functions from the former Rule Change Panel and the Economic Regulation Authority to Energy Policy WA. These related to rule administration and market development under the wholesale electricity market rules and the gas services information rules. And we also made a consistent allocation of responsibilities under the new Pilbara Networks rules, which commenced on 1 July this year. Project Eagle builds on these changes. The project looks to further clarify roles, improve consistency, and address some of the deficiencies in our regulatory framework to establish arrangements that will better suit the changing electricity sector and are better able to evolve over time. So Ash is about to give you a bit more detail on this, but you'll see it really touches mostly on the roles of the Coordinator of Energy, Energy Policy WA, as well as the Economic Regulation Authority. To achieve these changes, which are broader, we'll need legislation. The discussion paper that we've just released is really the start of a process which will run over several years, starting where we are now at the conceptual design of that new framework, which will inform a package of legislative changes. And then over the coming years, we'll work our way through the details of regulations and rules. This makes this project a little bit different to some of the other energy transformation work, which I know many of you have been involved in, where we've tended to dive right in at the details level to solve particular problems. With this one, we really are stepping back and looking first at the concepts and the structure of our regulatory framework to establish something that's fit for purpose for the future. So I'll now hand over to Ash to tell you a little bit more about our proposals.
Thank you, Kate, and good morning, everybody. So today I'll take you through an overview of the Energy and Governance Legislation Reform Project. I'll provide a bit of context and set the scene, talk about the need for reform and identify some of the problems in our regulatory framework, how we propose to address those problems, and an overview of some of the key elements of the reform, and then outline our next steps, and then conclude, I guess, the session with some questions. Katie, next slide. So the energy transformation, as we all know, is continuing. It's being underpinned by technological advances, new and innovative business models, evolving consumer preferences. Intermittent renewable resources now make up, a fair share of generation mix in terms of technologies. And rooftop solar PV, the installation of these devices is continuing to increase. And these things are creating challenges for us. Daytime demand is continuing to fall. The power system is changing from one-way flows of power to seeing more two-way flows of power. These are creating challenges for the continued safe, secure and reliable operation of the power system. But at the same time, transformation is also creating opportunities for us, opportunities to help us manage these challenges. The same advances in technologies, the same business models and innovative services can help us to create a smarter and more flexible power system that can manage these challenges. But the thing is, our regulatory framework cannot adapt and respond quickly and effectively to this change. So what's wrong? Keely, next slide. This is just an overview of all the instruments that we've got sitting under the Electricity Industry Act, which is one piece of legislation governing the energy framework. And as you can see, there are so many different instruments and regulations that are required and made under this piece of legislation. I won't go through all of them. Keely, next slide. But you can see that we've got too many instruments that have created a fragmented and disparate regulatory regime. We've got many instruments that are lengthy, that contain complicated and complex regulatory provisions. The amount of instruments that we have and the volume of content can make our regulatory regime quite difficult to navigate, particularly so for the smaller and less resourced players in our market. And of course, with that many instruments, there are bound to be inconsistencies and overlaps in coverage. Having a lot of instruments as well means that change isn't very well coordinated across all those different instruments. And that's because we've got all those instruments have different change processes, different decision makers, and also various objectives sitting in those subsidiary instruments. The other thing that's also creating issues for us are limitations in the enabling powers in our primary legislation. It's becoming increasingly difficult and sometimes impossible for us to develop adequate and coordinated regulatory responses to some of the key issues that we're seeing today. So, for example, AEMO currently cannot be given any formal functions under Western Power's technical rules, even though the technical rules have a direct impact on power system operations. Also, we can't create and prescribe new standards and requirements for the connection and operation of devices on the distribution network. That's limiting our ability to properly integrate, distributed energy resources properly into our power system. Next slide, Kelly. So these problems are the main reason why we're embarking on a pretty extensive program of energy and governance legislation. What we want to achieve with this project is to create a regulatory framework that is agile and responsive to the challenges and opportunities presented by the energy transformation, but also recognizing that the stability, the importance of a stable regulatory environment. We also want a regulatory framework that evolves in a coordinated fashion, in line with broader strategic priorities and supported by robust, timely, and transparent decision-making processes. We want a framework that reduces barriers to competition, promotes innovation, and facilitates participation in flexible technologies to help us address the risks coming out of this energy transition. And also, we want to have a regulatory framework that's easy to navigate and understand. We want to make it easier for industry participants to identify the rules that apply to them and understand what they mean. If we can do all of this, then we'll go a long way to ensuring that we've got a regulatory framework that works to protect and advance the interests of energy consumers into the future. Next slide here. So, how do we address these problems? What's our solution? There's two main things that we'll be doing. Firstly, we're going to create a regulatory framework, a centralized regulatory framework that consolidates the currently disparate regulatory arrangements governing electricity supply into a single instrument. And as we do this, we'll look to see whether the content of the instruments that we are incorporating into this new instrument is up to date, relevant and applicable, and whether and how the content can be improved. Having a centralized regulatory framework will allow us to develop and apply an end-to-end governance framework that supports dynamic change management with robust and timely decision making. We're going to call this new instrument Energy Rules Western Australia. These energy rules are going to be the centerpiece of our reforms. They are the most significant thing we'll be doing as part of this project. The other main thing we'll be doing is making some various enhancements and modifications to other aspects of the energy regulatory framework. We want to make them fit for purpose in our rapidly changing environment. And as we do that, we'll look to rationalize and abolish, where it makes sense to do so, those elements that are no longer required or are out of date. So that's what we're doing. What are we not doing? Next slide, Kelly. So for the most part, this reform is about improving the regulatory arrangements for electricity supply in Swiss. And that's mainly because that's where the impacts of the energy transformation are being felt, in terms of the challenges and opportunities that's been created. So matters relating to gas are out of scope, except for matters that touch on customer protections. And I'll touch a little bit about how that fits in with our program a little later. The new Pilbara regime will remain separate, but we'll look to consolidate the Pilbara Network rules and the Pilbara Network Access Code into a single instrument as well, and have the same philosophy of having a centralized framework to govern that instrument. And the other matters relating to the supply of electricity outside of the Swiss are also not being considered at this stage. I should mention here that because the instruments that we're looking at consolidating and incorporating into these new energy rules also touches on matters outside of electricity supply matters outside of the Swiss, we'll have to give some careful consideration next year as to how we maintain those requirements separately. Whether we create a new instrument or whether we leave those old instruments at, as they are, is something that we'll consider more thoroughly as we proceed into design development next year. And the last thing I want to mention before we move on is also that Project Eagle is mostly a legislative vehicle. We are facilitating the implementation of a bunch of different policy projects that are being led by some pretty talented people here at EPWA. And we'll be working very closely with those other teams throughout this process to ensure that we properly understand what their legislative and regulatory requirements are and make sure that we give effect to them. I'll talk a little bit about what those other projects are in a minute and provide you some contact details. Right. So let's have a bit of a look at what is going to be, what is going to form this new set of energy rules. The figure on the left there sets up the main elements that are going to form the basis of the energy rules. So things like power system security and reliability, the operation of the wholesale electricity market, connection and access to the network. These things are effectively going to be chapters in this new rule book. The collection of figures on the right relate to the instruments associated with those key elements. So there's the access code made under Part 8 of the EI Act, the customer code for electricity, matters required under Part 2, Section 39. The light shaded blue figures all deal with instruments that are required under the EI Act. The yellow shaded figure is the Gas Marketing Code, which is made under the Energy Coordination Act. And the orange figure is an instrument that the ERA developed. And I'll touch on that in a minute, but it's mainly there to plug the gap in customer protections in the Electricity Code, Gas Marketing Code. So let's let me just touch a little bit on some of these elements that will make up the energy rules. Power system security and reliability. Quite like the So you've got Western Power's technical rules, you've got the WEM rules, you've got the network quality and reliability of supply code, you've got the Electricity Act of 1945. And as the transformation has continued, there have been inconsistencies, gaps in coverage emerging between the various different standards that make up the PSSR framework. And also the standards themselves aren't fit for purpose in this fast changing world that we've got. So the most urgent need for us is to rationalize and consolidate the PSSR framework and wrap it up into this new rule book with a consistent set of change processes and governance functions. This work, or the policy behind this work, is being led by Dora Kizileva and Wholesale Markets team. The operation of the wholesale market, I mean, there's been some extensive redesign of that framework as part of the first stage of the energy transformation. Similarly, the access code has been updated significantly as part of the transformation strategy. But I might mention a couple of things in relation to the connection and access to the network. The first thing is we don't really have a clear regulatory framework that governs the requirements for connecting and operating devices and equipment connected at the distribution level. Most of the requirements are found in guidelines, practice manuals developed by Western Power. So we want to provide a clear regulatory basis for these requirements moving forward. The second thing I'll mention is that the distribution network was designed mainly for one-way flows of power, with no need for any real-time monitoring and control. But the transformation is turning all of this around on its head. With more and more devices that are being connected at the distribution level and two-way flows of power, we're going to need more active monitoring and control. So we need to start defining some roles and responsibilities for a distribution systems operator and possibly a distribution market operator. And this work on DSO and DMO roles and responsibilities is work that's being led by Aidan Barker and his team over at Networks and Customer Protection, Customer Participation. Electricity licensing, so there's a few different aspects to that. Again, Firstly, there's a lot of work that's been done by Matthew Martin and his team at Consumer Policy on developing a new framework for alternative electricity services, or AES. These are simply just a growing range of innovative electricity services that involve selling and management of electricity under arrangements that were not contemplated when the licensing regime was first conceived. To cater for these new AES, previously we've had to rely on the granting of exemptions, which is not a good outcome for consumers who would assume a similar level of customer protections that attach to the obligations of more traditional licensed operators. So we've got to fix that. Then there are some administrative amendments that we'll be making to the licensing regime, and these largely come out of previous ERA reviews to the customer protection framework. There's a paper on this called the Legislative Amendments to Improve the Efficiency of the Energy Licensing Regime, and I believe that paper is going to be published shortly, so keep a lookout for that. Finally, in terms of licensing, we're looking to transfer responsibility granting exemptions from the governor to the ERA, so that there's one entity responsible for the granting of licenses and issuing licensing exemptions. In terms of customer protection, again, like other aspects of our broader energy regulatory framework, the framework for customer protections is spread across 3 different instruments. You've got the Electricity Customer Code made under Part 6 of the EI Act. You've got the Gas Marketing Code made under Part 2C of the Energy Coordination Act. And then you've got this document that's prepared by the ERA as a compendium of gas customer license obligations to plug the gaps in customer protections between the Electricity Customer Code and the Gas Marketing Code. So we're going to take all these 3 instruments, combine them into a unified customer protection framework, and incorporate that into the energy rules so that customer protections can evolve and adapt to the changing energy landscape. Next slide, please. So how are we going to implement the energy rules? When we looked at this, we thought about 2 different approaches. Our first approach was to create a brand new instrument with new enabling powers inserted into the EI Act. And the second approach was to select an instrument, an existing instrument that we thought had the desired characteristics of a set of governance and institutional arrangements that we liked. We went with the second approach. We've selected the web rules as the instrument that had the desired characteristics of governance and institutional arrangements that we like. There are some enhancements and improvements that we can make to that framework, but on the basis it provides a solid starting ground for us. And so what we'll do is expand the scope of matters that Part 9 of the EI Act can consider, to include things like connection and access to the network, licensing, customer protections, power system security and reliability. We're also going to clarify the functions and continue that work that was done under the previous governance reforms, clarify the functions performed by the various entities under the Energy Rules WA. We're going to allow the Cordon of Energy to evolve and amend the ERWA, consistent with the new roles and responsibilities of that entity. We're going to look to provide a more fair and equitable way of cost recovery for administering rules. We're going to maintain the protected provisions mechanism currently in the WEM rules, provide for the establishment of advisory committees. So things like the Consumer Consultative Committee that provides advice to the ERA on consumer protection matters. We'll look to continue something like that. We'll also look to establish a technical advisory committee for matters relating to security and reliability of the power system. We'll also maintain the framework for civil penalties and reviewable decisions, and also look to disapply tabling obligations for the energy rules, but still maintain the status of this instrument as subsidiary legislation under the terms of the Interpretation Act. So simply amalgamating and consolidating a whole bunch of instruments into one document, we're quite aware that that might of itself create something that's also unwieldy, long and complex. So as part of all this work in creating these new energy rules, we're going to look to reform some of that content of the existing instruments so that we can create a more accessible and agile system of rules that is easier to understand and navigate. And the way we're going to do that is to look at reducing some of that volume by getting rid of unnecessary prescription, getting rid of irrelevant and outdated information and provisions, simplifying content where possible by translating requirements into plain English, and trying to establish that outcome-based regulation into new rule design. I'll say that in terms of the provision of an essential service, some level of prescription is going to be necessary. So we'll only look to do something like this where it makes sense to do so. And where it makes sense to retain prescription, we'll maintain prescription. Right. The other aspect of what we're doing here is enhancing and modifying other aspects of the energy and electricity regulatory framework. The EI Act doesn't really have an overarching objective. Instead, we've got objectives that are included in various subsidiary instruments made under the Act. So you've got the access code objectives, you've got the objectives that sit with the wholesale market. Objectives are important because they guide the evolution of the regulatory framework and provide stability and predictability to the market in the midst of rapid change. Having different sets of objectives creates uncertainty, and this can create or increase the risk of regulatory risk. So we're going to look at developing a more suitable or a suitable overarching objective for inclusion in the EI Act to guide the development and operation of the energy rules and other subordinate instruments. The precise wording of this objective will be developed in consultation with industry as we move into these detailed design and development next year, but it will include consideration of such matters as the interests of consumers, having a secure and reliable and affordable provision of electricity supply services, and look to incorporate broader environmental objectives as well, provision of electricity. We'll also look at enhancing the coordinator of energy's role to make sure that it is properly empowered and resourced to carry out its additional roles and responsibilities in terms of undertaking policy and technical reviews, market development and rulemaking. We'll be looking to enhance the ERA's powers to enforce compliance with this new framework. So there's currently some gaps and deficiencies in the ERA's powers. It can issue licenses, but can't suspend or revoke it. Also, the ERA, I think currently for low-level infringements, needs to go through an administrative process and seek the Electricity Review Board's decision before it can issue those infringements. So we're going to give the ERA more powers to be able to do that directly. So we'll look at improving those arrangements. In terms of the energy buyback schemes, these were established as an outworking of the licensing regime, and also from the minister's ability to direct the government trading enterprises to do things. So we want to provide more clearer regulatory obligations on the GTEs to purchase renewable energy, purchase distributed energy from small use customers, as well as any other classes of customers that may be prescribed from time to time. We'll be making improvements to the existing framework that provide retail of last resort arrangements, electricity and gas. In terms of the dispute resolution framework, this has been on the cards for some while, but we're looking to abolish the statutory position of the energy disputes arbitrator, transfer arbitration under state energy legislation to private arbitration, and also look to transfer the functions of the Electricity Review Board to the State Administrative Tribunal, which is more consistent with the government's philosophy of how reviews of administrative decisions should be handled. And then there are a range of other opportunities that we may identify to continue to rationalise and modernise our electricity laws. And the extent to which we'll take up these opportunities will be dictated in part by the timing that we've got, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. But it's a lot of work to draft legislative amendments, and we haven't got a lot of time to do that. So whether or not we take up this opportunity is something we'll turn our mind to over the course of next year as we move into detailed design. Next slide, please, Keely. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that Project Eagle is a legislative vehicle primarily. This provides you a bit of an overview of some of the other key elements that make up this project and who they've been led by. I won't spend too much time on this. Suffice to say that we've got some contacts and links to web pages where you would, if you would like to find out a bit more information on some of these projects. Please make use of these links. Next page, please, Kelly. So our next steps. We are here in October at the Industry Forum. Our first key milestone is to get government approval to commence our work, which is basically government approval to draft our legislative amendments. And we're targeting cabinet approval by the end of the year, so by December. To meet that timeframes, we've really got to have our package submitted into the government process by the end of November. Hence, some somewhat shortened timeframes for industry engagement at this point. But it would allow us, if we got cabinet approval before the end of the year, it would allow us to commence the legislative drafting process early next year and spend the first half of next year drafting the legislative amendments, targeting an introduction of a single bill into Parliament in the second half of next year. And if things go well, we hope that the bill will pass by the end of next year. But if not, hopefully by the middle of 2023. And during this drafting process, the parliamentary process, we'll be commencing the work, the design and development of this new energy rules. And during this period, there'll be a lot more consultation with industry on as we proceed with design and development. So I guess while it may seem like we've only given you a short period to look at what we're doing and provide some feedback on it, I just wanted to assure you all that from next year there'll be a lot more consultation with industry as we proceed with design and development. The exact, I guess, form of the consultation is something that we'll decide, but we'll keep ourselves open and flexible. We'll hold forums as needed. We'll have working groups and leverage existing working groups that are available, and we're always open to have one-on-one discussions with anyone on any of the matters that are that relate to this particular project. And I guess we're targeting from Q3 of 2023 the go live of the new energy rules framework. It's likely going to be staged over several months, but that's kind of the target date that we're working towards. So that's kind of all I've had to say in terms of a high-level overview of what this project's all about. So next steps. I'm not sure, Kate, if you've got anything final to say before we move on to questions.
No, thanks, Ash. I think now a great time to get into questions, and I see we've had quite a few come through the chat function already. Mark, I'll just get you to publish those last couple so the group can see. Now I'm at a little disadvantage because I can't see the full list of questions on my screen at least, but I might kick off with a couple that there have been a few questions around, and then we might get into some of the more specific ones. So there's been a few questions asking really about the change process for the new Energy Rules Western Australia, ERWA. And so for those that are not familiar with how the wholesale electricity market rules are currently changed, you wouldn't know that off the top of your head. So let me just explain. So the idea is to base it on how the WEM rules and the GSI rules for that matter are currently amended. And this may be modified a little bit once we get into the detailed drafting, but conceptually we want to follow the process that's already there. So just by way of outline, any person can propose a change to the rules, and that includes the Coordinator of Energy, but any person. So you know, from a consumer perspective or an industry perspective, you could propose a change to the rules. Then the coordinator is required to follow a prescriptive process which is outlined in the rules, which includes 2 rounds of consultation, including on drafting of the proposed rule change, and ultimately a final decision which is needed to that process. It's all published and transparent, and it's not just the coordinator that can propose changes. Actually, any person can propose changes. Another feature of that rule change process, which Ash touched on, is the concept of protected provisions. So these apply to matters like governance or around compliance and enforcement, which are really very important policy matters or governance matters, which it wouldn't be appropriate for the coordinator to amend and to make the final decision on. So where the rules relate to things that are designated protected provisions, the minister ultimately makes the decision on those rule changes, which is all kind of broadly consistent with how the WEM rules work today. So hopefully that answers some of the questions around how that rule change process works. If you're familiar with how the AEMC does rule changes in the national electricity market, it's really similar to that as well. So we've got some quite similar processes across the country. There have been a couple of questions, I think they've been published, about emissions policy integration, which I thought I'd just provide a little bit of background on. One of the things that we are certainly looking to do as part of this Project Eagle is establish an objective in the Electricity Industry Act. Much like we've recently amended the objective for the access code, the new objective will have a component which is around environmental sustainability or emissions reduction. Now, we haven't worked out the precise wording, but that is certainly intended to be a component of the objective of the Act moving forward. So that's one way that we'll see an explicit link, I guess, to broader sustainability goals. Otherwise, at this stage, there's no government policy which is a specific mechanism for emissions reduction in Western Australia, at least. There's obviously mechanisms nationally which apply through the Renewable Energy Target and other things, but there's no WA-based mechanisms around low emissions energy, and so the rules won't deal with those specifically. But I think the other thing just to be aware of, the government released its climate policy, Western Australian climate policy, I'm going to say late last year. Hopefully my brain remembers that. I think it was in December last year or late November last year. That is now being implemented. It was a reasonably high level policy, but now government is working through how to implement that. And you may have heard a mention of sectoral emissions reduction strategies. So those will be developed over coming years. So it's a bit of a watch this space at a whole of government level in Western Australia for emissions reduction. But certainly we intend to provide a sustainability concept as part of our objective. Okay, Mark, are there any other kind of areas? I think, Ash, and I might flip to you on this one. We have had a couple of questions about the proposal to amend how contestability is defined. So rather than being a customer, making it by a supply point.
By supply point, yeah, that's right. And I think those relate to the accessibility orders that we provide for under the framework. So we're just going to amend that so that it's related to supply points rather than customers. So it makes it easier to address the contestability issues and thresholds later in the future.
I think there's been a bit of sort of practical confusion and challenges in how the current definition applies, but it is obviously a change, so you're welcome obviously through the feedback process to give us your thoughts on that change as well as the rest of the proposal. What should we go to next?
Let's see what was published. Okay. All right, so will consultation be about the principles of the change or the specifics of the implementation by Anonymous? No, so the consultation that we'll undertake next year, the detail, as we proceed with detailed design and development, is really going to talk to you guys about how the content of the various instruments can be improved and refined and made more simpler, and also how we will integrate those various instruments into this new rule book. So it's really quite, my anticipation is that it's going to be quite detailed consultation with you on the finer aspects of what this rule book is going to be. As we do that, we'll also come back and start talking to you about the actual drafting of the legislative amendments themselves, with a view to, obviously trying to get that into Parliament the second half of next year. We just want to make sure that you guys understand the amendments to primary legislation that we're making and how that will enable us to implement this new rule book and the things we're trying to achieve as part of this report. Given the tight consultation time frame, what exactly are you looking for from us at this stage? Okay, so really the purpose of our engagement with industry at this point in time is just to flag to you that we are doing this pretty massive project, and give you an overview of the key elements that make up this project. So what we're looking from you is nothing too detailed, but feel free to give us as much detail as you want. But we're really trying to flag to you, this is what we're doing, and have you got any thoughts and comments and feedback on what it is that we're doing in terms of a concept, and is there anything else you would like us to look at as part of this project? Next year, when we come back to you, we'll seek your feedback itself on the actual drafting of provisions and the like.
I think I should add there as well, Ash has made the point a couple of times that this is really a vehicle. We're looking at legislative change, the creation of a single rule book. The different components of that rule book are being developed through a range of different projects, and indeed are already in place in a lot of cases. And so that detailed consultation on, for example, the power system security and reliability framework, which is an acknowledged sort of gap in our current regulatory framework, and something that the task force made some recommendations on prior to concluding earlier this year. That will be developed separately. It'll have its own consultation, and we'll sort of fold the actual provisions ultimately into the single rule book. Someone, in fact, I think it's up there at the moment, the ERA, as many of you are aware, is currently doing a very comprehensive review of the customer protection framework, both for electricity and gas. We're obviously in touch with the ERA on that. The intention really is for that process to conclude on its current timelines. We won't be combining it into a single rule book for quite some time to come. So what we'll do is we'll take the final product once the ERA has concluded that review and fold that into the new rule book. So if you're engaged in that process, please continue to engage in that process because that needs to run its course as well.
There's a question there from Anonymous. Does that mean, I don't think it's related to customer protection, so that ERA review, but does that mean Horizon Power customers could be covered by different rules to Western Power Synergy customers? We certainly don't want to change how things currently work, but certainly there could be the possibility that things diverge, because we've got now an instrument that relates to electricity supply, SWIS, and other aspects that relate to non-SWIS areas. So that certainly could emerge over time, but certainly our intent at this point in time is not to create different or to change the way things currently operate in terms of the substantive content of these rules and provisions.
Thanks, Ash. I was just going to put that in a slightly different way, which is, of course, there are already some differences in the framework applying to Horizon Power compared to Synergy, with Horizon Power being an integrated service provider in the regions. So those differences will remain. So to the extent there are already differences between how Horizon Power and Synergy are regulated, they won't be changed by this. And to the extent that they are already complying with some of the same obligations, which they are as retailers in some cases, those would continue. So it's essentially maintaining the status quo, but as Ash said, that's always possible that it will change in the future. Where was I going to go with that? There was a question about retail contestability. Just a really quick answer to that. So this project, Project Eagle, is not looking at retail contestability. Some of you may be aware that the Minister for Energy has asked us to have a look at expanding retail contestability for small business customers, including small business customers in embedded networks. So that project is continuing in parallel to that. If that results in some change, that might need to be accommodated in these instruments, but this project is not looking at contestability.
Does the project include reviewing the requirement for generators to be licensed? Look, I don't want to handball this.
I can take this one, that's okay. Not directly, however, many of you would be aware that the ERA has done some reviews of the licensing regime in previous years, and Energy Policy WA is working through those, including the proposal to get rid of generation licences and other improvements to the licensing framework. So those projects, and I think that slide at the back incorporates that particular project. You'll see some consultation papers on some licensing improvements fairly shortly. So keep an eye out for those.
I was going to handball that to Matthew Martin's team. But yeah, as Kate said, there's a paper I think I mentioned in the Preso. I think it's called legislative amendments to improve the efficiency of the licensing regime. So that should come out shortly. So keep an eye out for that.
Query about the time frame from Jacinda. It's a long-term project, as we're open to a longer consultation period on this paper. Only within some limits. So if you've got a particular crunch at your end and you want to have a discussion with us about how you participate in the consultation, please get in touch and we can handle that. Look, I think Jacinda Ash has partly answered this already, which is at this stage we're really talking concept. So I appreciate you need to get your heads around it. We haven't given you a hell of a lot of time to do that. But at this stage, really just think we're talking concepts. There will be plenty of time to get into the detail over the next couple of years. So if you've got issues and queries, please raise them. But we do have a reasonably limited consultation window at this stage because this is just really to kick off the project. There's plenty more consultation to come. I really like this next question from Anonymous because it points pretty much to one of the reasons why we need to do this reform project. So the question is, why do the current WEM rules only include generators connected to the transmission network, e.g. generator performance standards, GPS? And it goes on to talk about distribution connected generators. So the WEM rules are really interesting. They do actually apply to distribution connected generators to the extent they participate in the wholesale electricity market. But for those that have been involved in the WEM rules development and the recent transition of generator performance standards into the WEM rules for transmission connected generators, there are some differences, and the WEM rules do deal with more matters relating to transmission connected generators than they do distribution. The reason for that is that the heads of power for the WEM rules don't currently allow it to consider things like generator performance standards for distribution connected generators. And so this is one of the problems we've got with the current regulatory framework. So those matters are still contained in Western Power's technical rules, which Ash used as an example earlier. The technical rules don't have a role for AEMO. So there are deficiencies in how all of that works. So the purpose of bringing all of these into a single instrument is to allow appropriate obligations and roles to be placed on all of the parties and to allow for better integration of bits of the regulatory framework which have to date had to be kept quite separate. So I think it's a great example of why we need to do something like this reform.
Kate, there's a question here relating to the changing of contestability at a supply point rather than customer.
I think that's the one you've already dealt with.
Yeah, okay.
So yeah, we've had a couple of questions at that point. These are some of the questions about the rule change process, which hopefully I've covered. If you're not sure how all that works, just have a look at the WEM rules, or in fact a similar look at the national rules.
Consultation processes for the new ERA WA and changes have been covered already.
References to rules. This is a good question, and the short answer is we haven't got there yet. The WEM rules as a document won't exist anymore. It will be replaced by the Energy Rules WA, but how we refer to different matters within the rules is something that we'll work out as we get to the detail, whether it's convenient to keep some of those references or whether we want to just transition to an ERWA. Thanks. I think we're just scrolling through most of these. I think we've answered. Hang on. Is it in scope and will it be clear in the regs and the framework? A, who will hold Western Power to account for connection processes, and how Western Power will be held?
Who and how?
Sorry?
Who and how?
Who and how? That's a very specific point, which we're not at the point of answering yet, but I think the point I will make is what we are really trying to do in relation to the ERA's role is make it clearer what the matters are that the ERA monitors and enforces compliance with, and really strengthen that to allow the ERA to deal with more, particularly lower level matters without them needing to be escalated to other bodies. So we have work to do on compliance and enforcement, but I can't answer that specific question right now.
Lots of rules for APRA to manage now in the future and coordinate. Can we ensure resourcing is increased to allow adequate focus at time of change to the help?
Thank you, Anonymous, singing from my hymn sheet. Look, the resourcing of Energy Policy WA is obviously something that's important as we work through this. I'd make kind of 2 points. One is that at the moment, many of these instruments are, in a legal sense, managed by the Minister, which means actually in practice, Energy Policy WA already does work on them. So it's not a massive change to the scope of the subject matters that we deal with. Hopefully, in some ways, this makes our job easier because we have a consistent process for how we manage changes through all of that. But one of the things that we are looking at through this is cost recovery across the sector as a whole. Part of that is, as many of you know, Energy Policy WA is now funded in part by industry for its role under the WEM rules. That gives us a degree of, I guess, funding autonomy, which is helpful for maintaining these roles moving forward. And so we'll look at making sure that that funding framework is fit for purpose for the future. And also, to the extent things like the new Alternative Electricity Services framework are being introduced, making sure that we share the costs of administration of the sector, whether that's our costs, ERA's costs, AEMO's costs, share that equitably across all of the parties that have a role now to play in our evolving energy space.
Quick question about the role of the ERA is unclear. Look, we'll clear that all up, but I think the ERA is the concept of that role, that the entity in the future has been clarified by government. It's going to be an economic regulator, price setter, and responsible for enforcement and compliance. But we'll certainly look to make some things clear as part of this program.
Yeah, you'll see the detail of that. But yes, the intention from government is that the ERA is the compliance monitoring and enforcement body, much like the Australian Energy Regulator is in the national market.
What consideration has been given to regulatory burden on participants to operate compliantly with the continually changing rules and procedures? So I think one of the things we want, one of the objectives we want is a more agile and responsive framework, but at the same time, we also understand we need to maintain some regulatory stability. So I think one of the good things with bringing responsibility for developing rules into the coordinator is that there's a central body now, a central entity, a single entity responsible for overseeing the development of that framework, and that can occur on a more strategic basis. So it doesn't happen willy-nilly. Over time, there's a program of works, hopefully, that shows how the market rules or the new rules framework will evolve in line with broader priorities and changes in the sector.
In terms of managing compliance with the changing rule book, this is sort of a feature, unfortunately, of the world that we're living in, where we're trying to catch the regulatory framework up to what's happening in the sector reasonably quickly. It is a matter that we always consider as part of a particular change. So, for example, the current introduction of security constrained economic dispatch in our wholesale electricity market. Before we go live there is an extensive period proposed for market trials, which is really a chance for participants to fine-tune their compliance in a sandpit before things go live. As we go through other reforms, we always think about those transitions and implementation challenges. And if need be, there's different things that we can do, things like market trials and other mechanisms to give participants a chance to come to grips with the changes before they do bite in earnest. So yeah, it's not necessarily a feature of Project Eagle per se, but certainly the different components of the work that will be caught up in this vehicle.
Okay, there's a question about whether retailers and generators will be invited onto the working groups.
Yes, so we haven't got to the point yet of designing working or scoping out working groups for this, but there will certainly need to be some. And we would anticipate, much like most of our working groups, it will really be open for anyone who's interested to participate in those. They are a bit of there's a time commitment obviously involved, but we appreciate having as many interested parties as possible. So yes, watch this space. That will come most likely in the new year.
Sorry, I'm just scrolling through, given that we've got about 4 minutes to go, just to pick out some questions here.
Ash, can you just mute it for a second?
Oh, that's okay. Sourcing.
For those that wonder where our market fee amount for the coordinator next year will be released, it's in accordance with the WEM rules. So I think we're required at a date in June each year to give that information to AEMO. So we've given it for this financial year. We will do that by the due date for next financial year, just in the ordinary course of events.
This question there about the rules having a specific obligation on minimising the costs seen by customers. I mean, look, affordability is going to be part of the overall objective that we create in this new EI Act. So yes, but more broadly, I guess.
Yeah, I think, and when you are thinking about what might that objective look like, we'll share the drafting with you, and we'll give you a chance to give us feedback on the actual drafting. But essentially, it's going to try and capture the good old energy trilemma, right? Safe, secure, reliable, affordable, and increasingly clean energy. So those are all concepts which you will see embedded somehow in our objective, which will obviously guide decision making under the entire framework, and is consistent with the government's broad policy objectives in the energy space. Is there anything else there that we have not addressed?
Mark, you're highlighting the question there. What was it?
Just on emissions, there's been a few on whether emissions have been integrated.
Yeah, that's fine. That's all good. That's where we go.
We've answered it. Emissions, consider
principle-based responsive regulator.
Yeah. Which that's a really good point, and how we word this is probably just a feature of who's holding the pen at the time. We have got in mind that where possible we will simplify the detail that lives in those rules, and where we can we'll go to objectives-based and principle-based drafting, but it really does need to depend on the subject matter, and in some cases prescription is really important. So we're not throwing babies out with bathwater here, but it is something that we always look through that lens as we get the opportunity to refresh instruments, just to see if we can bring it back to what it's trying to achieve rather than be overly prescriptive about the how.
I think there's a few more comments and questions there about considering how we can implementing a more agile and responsive framework. Technical rules will be applied in future and will not be considered in future. Not sure if that's a question, but there'll continue to be technical rules governing how the network is built and operated. We just want to make sure that there's technical rules that can be applied to both West Power as a network operator and AEMO as a system operator, so that actions can be better coordinated.
And they will be moved into the new.
And they will be moved into the new rule book. Yep.
Yep. So the technical rules which are currently made under the access code will form part of the new ERWA.
A comment here, I guess, about the clunkiness of the existing WEM rule change process. Look, while we are using the WEM rules process as a basis, we'll certainly be open to how that can be improved moving forward, and we'll consult with you, of course, next year on how we can make that process work better.
Yeah, so we're definitely open to making sure that rule change process is appropriate for the full range of matters that will fall within the ERWA. And I think some of the areas you might turn your mind to are things like consultative committees and who are the parties that need to be around the table. Consultative committees have a really important role to play, but they need to be, you know, the right mix of people and perspectives to bring to the matter. So there's definitely room for those matters to be considered as we get to the detailed drafting of the process.
So it's 11, but I might just finish on this last question here. I think I did touch on it in the preso. So the NQRS code applies to other parts of to others apart from HP or WP networks. If the NQRS code is bundled under the WAER, where will the requirements for independent networks be covered? So I think I've mentioned that we'll need to give this some fairly careful consideration, you know, over the course of the design and development of the new energy rules WA framework. We want to make sure that principally what we're trying to do is not change things, and where we need to leave additional requirements, of not additional, but existing requirements for the non-Swiss areas, we need to give some thought as to whether we create new instruments for that or whether we leave the existing instruments as they are. But we'll give some more thought to that, consult, come back and talk to you about how that's all going to work next year.
And if you've got some views on that, please don't hesitate to let us know, even at this stage. So the options kind of vary from either include them all in the ERWA and make sure that it's clear who they apply to, or keep them separate. And they're probably kind of the options, but they're not going away. We just need to find the right instrument to put them in.
So I think we might wrap up there, Kate. It's 1 minute past 11.
Yep, thanks Ash, and thanks everyone for your participation today. Some really great questions there, and I'm sure as you think about this further, you will have more ideas and questions for us. Please don't hesitate to reach out. You can see in the consultation paper that we've identified a few different ways that we're happy to take your feedback. And really, we're happy to take it in whatever way is most convenient for you. So if you want to put in a written submission, absolutely welcome to do that. We prefer we could publish those, so give some thought to that as you draft them. If you would prefer to just send us an email, that's fine. If you'd like to catch up for a discussion about it, that's also absolutely fine for us. So please just reach out to us through any of those channels, and we're really happy to keep discussing this with you. I just emphasise this is the start of this discussion. We haven't given you a long stretch for this first stage, but we will be working on the drafting of the legislation. We will consult on the drafting of the legislation, and then over time we'll get into the details of the regulations and the rules. So plenty to come on this.
And I just let everybody know that we have recorded this presentation, so we'll make a copy of it available as soon as we can, and a copy of the slides as well. So, yeah.
Thanks, Ash. Thanks to Mark and Keely who have been driving things behind the scenes for us today. And thanks very much everyone for your participation. Don't hesitate to reach out, probably to Ash in the first instance if you do want to have any further discussions about any of this. Thanks and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.